Cold showers and coffee both feel like they wake up your brain. But which one actually spikes your dopamine more? And what does the data say about your norepinephrine and cortisol too? Sound familiar? Okay, here's the thing. Cold exposure hits a stress and alert switch fast. Your body reads the cold as a threat to fix the problem, so you get a surge in norepinephrine first, more ready-up energy. Dopamine's in the mix too, but it's not always a simple more cold equals more dopamine story. Now coffee is different. Caffeine blocks adenosine, so your brain stops getting that go-to-sleep signal. That revs your alertness systems and can bump dopamine signaling in a more rewardish, drive-to-act way. But here's the catch. That doesn't automatically mean it beats cold on dopamine output. Your baseline matters. Your timing matters. Your stress load matters. So what should you do with this right now? If you want a quick safety-first alert boost, cold can work, just don't go hero mode. We'll talk cold exposure safety guidelines you can follow without wrecking your nervous system. But here's the part nobody talks about. The Real Win might be using them for different goals. And this is where it gets wild. Your cortisol response can change how you feel afterward, sometimes for hours. Alright, if you had to pick one today, would you go cold shower or coffee? Drop it below. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe, more brain hacks every week. 1. Dopamine 101. What counts as spiking in human data? If you're trying to figure out whether cold showers or coffee spikes dopamine, here's the real hurdle. In humans, we don't measure dopamine like a dashboard readout. We mostly infer it from indirect markers, things like functional brain signals, hormone patterns, subjective arousal, and sometimes the way the nervous system behaves under controlled conditions. So the question isn't just which feels stronger, it's what in the data actually counts as a dopamine spike. In dopamine land, spiking is usually shorthand for short, time-locked increases in dopamine-related activity, right when a reward prediction, novelty cue, or motivating signal hits. But dopamine is tied to more than pleasure. It's tightly connected to motivation, salience, and learning why your brain decides something matters. That's why two people can feel the same hit, but the underlying chemistry might be driving different loops. On top of that, the brain dopamine system and peripheral measures don't always line up neatly in the way people expect. Huberman's framing is basically, dopamine isn't a simple on-off switch, and your best evidence comes from converging signals, not one vibe. Now take coffee. Caffeine doesn't magically dump dopamine straight into your bloodstream. What it does is block adenosine receptors, which normally promote sleep pressure and dampen alertness. When adenosine is blocked, you lose that braking effect and you tend to get a faster, more alert state. That can indirectly increase dopamine signaling in networks involved with motivation and attention. Dopamine gets implicated because the arousal and motivation systems talk to each other, and caffeine also influences other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, which is often easier to see in behavior and in stress-related physiology. Real talk. Coffee often feels like a clean, focused energizer, and the physiology frequently shows more consistent norepinephrine-driven alertness than a dramatic, direct dopamine spike in the way people picture it. Cold exposure is different. A cold shower is a strong stressor, and in human data you'd expect more robust activation of stress response pathways. Think norepinephrine and cortisol patterns showing up around the time of cold exposure. That doesn't mean dopamine can't be involved. It can be, especially through mechanisms like improved mood, increased salience of first can handle this, or post-stressor reward learning. But in plain English, cold is more likely to look like a norepinephrine and stress system event, with dopamine being more downstream, more what your brain learns and values afterward, than a quick dopamine-only spike you can point to. Here's the practical takeaway for what counts as spiking in real human data. If you're scanning for fast, measurable hits tied to motivation and alertness, you're more likely to see norepinephrine effects quickly with both coffee and cold, while dopamine-related conclusions are more interpretive unless the study directly measures dopamine signaling. So, use coffee when you want a rapid alert boost with a clearer, more predictable arousal profile. Use cold when you want to train tolerance and engage the stress activation pathway. Then your dopamine-related motivation can follow through the challenge-completed learning loop. But here's the part nobody talks about. The dopamine winner depends on how you define spiking, fast direct dopamine signaling, or the motivated drive you feel afterward. And that's where the safety and timing details get crucial. Which one are you going to try first? Drop it below. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe. More brain hacks every week. 2. Cold shower physiology, mechanisms, time course, and evidence. Cold water hits your body like an alarm button. It's not dopamine first, so much as stress activates energy fast. Your hypothalamus and sympathetic nervous system get the memo, and the cascade starts from there. Here's the physiology in plain English. Cold exposure triggers intense sensory input from your skin and nerves. Your brain treats that as a threat signal even when you're safe. That ramps up norepinephrine, noradrenaline, release for alertness and mobilization. You get faster heart rate, higher blood pressure, and that wired, ready-to-act feeling, your body basically getting you set for fight or flight, but in a controlled way. Dopamine can be involved downstream of arousal and motivation, but the cold-triggered spike people feel is more tightly tied to norepinephrine than to classic dopamine reward pathways. Time course matters, too. The adrenergic response tends to start quickly, often within the first minute or two of cold contact, because you're getting immediate nerve signaling from the cold stimulus. Norepinephrine is the headline actor early. Cortisol, the stress hormone, usually comes later than the immediate nervous system response, because your body has to engage the HPA axis, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal pathway. In real terms, early minutes feel sharp and activating. Later, if you push the stress high enough, cortisol rises to sustain the whole body mobilization. Your body's not just flipping one switch. It's stacking systems, instant alarm, then longer stress calibration. Now, what does real data say about dopamine specifically? If you look at how Huberman frames this on the Huberman Lab podcast, he's pretty consistent. Cold exposure is a strong lever for arousal and sympathetic activation, and those effects track closely with norepinephrine and overall alert state chemistry. Dopamine is more complicated. It's often better described as getting influenced by your interpretation, effort, novelty, challenge, and what your brain expects will happen next, than by cold water being a guaranteed dopamine juice machine. So if your goal is dopamine spike, coffee tends to be more direct because caffeine blocks adenosine, which changes arousal circuits and indirectly boosts dopamine signaling in reward motivation pathways. Cold is more like wake up the whole system, not reward center fireworks. At least not in the clean, direct way coffee can be. So what should you do with this practical style? Use cold when you want alertness, grit, and a fast mental reset, especially for mornings or before tough tasks. Keep it short and controlled, especially if you're new. Start with tolerable cold, then work down gradually over sessions. Don't chase numbness or pain. You're training your nervous system to respond, not trying to prove you can suffer. And if you're prone to anxiety or you're already physiologically amped, cold can sometimes add fuel, not calm. Your mileage will vary. Safety's the non-negotiable part. Cold showers are generally safe for healthy folks when you keep exposure reasonable and you don't jump in hyper-aggressively. Avoid cold plunges if you have certain cardiovascular risks. Think uncontrolled high blood pressure, history of heart rhythm problems, or known heart disease, because sudden cold can stress the cardiovascular system. If you're dealing with any of that, talk to a clinician before you use cold as a regular tool. Also, don't do cold exposure when you're dizzy, overheated from heavy exertion, or alone if you're going very intense. Your nervous system is powerful. Let's not make it do irresponsible stuff. But here's the part nobody talks about. Your dopamine response might depend more on your meaning of the cold challenge, how you approach it, than on the cold itself. And that's where the comparison to coffee gets really interesting, because it's not just chemistry, it's expectation and timing. Next up, we'll connect what Huberman and the broader neuroscience talk about with how coffee's caffeine effects unfold minute by minute, and when dopamine actually feels like it's driving the bus. Which one are you going to try first? Drop it below. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe. More brain hacks every week. 3. Coffee physiology, mechanisms, time course, and evidence. Coffee doesn't just wake you up. It nudges your whole catecholamine system, and the timing matters if you care about dopamine versus norepinephrine. On Huberman Lab, Andrew Huberman talks a lot about how caffeine mainly blocks adenosine receptors, which removes the brake on alertness circuitry, and that's what drives the surge in wakefulness you feel. Mechanism first. Adenosine normally builds up and makes you feel sleepy by slowing neural activity. Caffeine blocks that adenosine signaling, so your brain fires a bit more. That increased firing boosts downstream release of norepinephrine pretty reliably, and you also get changes in dopamine signaling, more indirect than the norepinephrine snap, though. The practical nuance is this: dopamine is involved in motivation and reward prediction, while norepinephrine is more directly tied to alertness, scanning your environment, and that on feeling. Your body also plays along. Stress hormones like cortisol can rise, but they don't all spike at the same time as your subjective wakefulness. Here's the time course piece that makes coffee confusing. Caffeine hits fast enough that you feel it as alertness relatively soon, but the hormonal and neural cascades are spread out. Norepinephrine-related effects tend to feel like the early win: sharper attention, faster mental momentum. Dopamine-related effects feel more like motivation and drive, and they can ride alongside the alertness boost, but they're not always the loudest signal you notice. Cortisol is its own story too. Coffee can influence the stress axis response, but many people see a shift in timing rather than a dramatic, instant cortisol equals caffeine equation. Sound familiar? You drink coffee and feel wired, then later you realize your body's still getting its gear sorted. What's the real evidence angle? Huberman Lab often points to the broader neurobiology. Caffeine's adenosine blockade is a well-established mechanism, and catecholamine changes follow from the altered brain firing patterns. For the exact dopamine spike size in humans, though, it's tricky. Direct dopamine spikes in the moment are hard to measure without specialized imaging, and even then you're looking at changes in binding or release proxies, not a simple dopamine meter. So the honest take is, coffee is a strong stimulant for alertness via norepinephrine pathways, and dopamine changes are part of the wake and motivate package. But norepinephrine is the more consistent, feel-it-immediately signal. If you're chasing dopamine specifically, coffee can still help. Just don't assume it's the cleanest dopamine-only move. So when should you use coffee practically? Use it when you need attention and drive, especially if you've got a task where staying on the thread is the bottleneck. If you're prone to jitters, racing thoughts, or anxiety, scale back and don't stack caffeine on top of a rough sleep debt. Matthew Walker keeps hammering that sleep loss makes stimulants feel harsher. Also, consider timing. If your goal is motivation, earlier in the day tends to feel cleaner for most people. Late-day caffeine can mess with your sleep, and worse sleep can blunt your dopamine reward learning the next day. But here's the part nobody talks about. You can feel dopamine as motivation while the actual early biochemical hit is often more norepinephrine-led. And this is where it gets wild. Cold exposure can flip that story because it drives a fast, survival-style arousal response that changes catecholamine dynamics differently than caffeine, with different comfort and safety trade-offs. Which one are you going to try first? Drop it below. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe. More brain hacks every week. For head-to-head review, what real studies actually compare? If you're hunting for the dopamine winner between a cold shower and coffee, here's the catch. There aren't great head-to-head trials that directly measure dopamine spikes in humans while you compare the two under the same conditions. That sounds like a buzzkill, but it's actually the honest starting point. Dopamine and norepinephrine get tangled together in real life, and the brain doesn't hand you a clean dopamine went up exactly this much scoreboard. Now, real talk, Huberman Lab often leans on what we can measure and what we know about mechanisms. Cold exposure is a stressor that reliably flips on the sympathetic nervous system. That tends to raise norepinephrine first, and dopamine can show up downstream because your brain is tagging the state change as salient. Coffee is different. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, which removes that slow-down signal, and that can indirectly boost dopamine signaling and also norepinephrine, especially in the alertness network. So if you're asking which spikes dopamine more, the data doesn't let you crown a single champ. But your lived experience usually lines up with norepinephrine dominance. Cold makes you feel instantly alert and braced. Coffee makes you feel energized and cognitively sharp. Here's where the real studies you can point to matter, even if they're not perfectly cold shower versus coffee side by side. In animal and human neuroscience work, cold exposure tends to activate stress physiology and sympathetic pathways, with downstream effects on catecholamines like norepinephrine. In contrast, caffeine's primary action is adenosine antagonism, and that shifts arousal circuits that are closely tied to dopaminergic signaling. Huberman's emphasis is basically, Don't pretend dopamine is the only lever. Cortisol, norepinephrine, heart rate, perceived stress, and sleep pressure all move too. And depending on timing, especially relative to your last sleep and your last meal, the dopamine feel can be driven more by arousal than by dopamine itself. Sound familiar? A lot of people call both experiences dopamine, but the body's story is more nuanced. Practical takeaway: if your goal is quick, wake-up energy, cold exposure often hits fast because it forces a nervous system ramp. If your goal is sustained cognitive drive, coffee often wins because it keeps you in an alert state longer without the same immediate whole-body shock. A smart move is to use timing like a lever. Cold early in the day can be a wake-up jolt, while coffee later can help you maintain focus. Just don't stack them so hard that your anxiety or heart rate goes haywire. For cortisol and stress safety, you don't want to treat cold like a punishment. It's a tool. Start mild. Keep sessions short. If you've got cardiovascular issues, uncontrolled blood pressure, or any reason cold exposure could be risky for you, skip it or clear it with a clinician first. But here's the part nobody talks about. Dopamine more might not be the right question if your real target is mood, motivation, or focus. Cold can boost alertness through norepinephrine and stress signaling. Caffeine can enhance signaling by changing adenosine tone. Your brain's reward system responds, sure, but it's operating on a bigger control panel than just dopamine. So the better question is, what effect do you want right now, and how does your body tend to react when you're stressed versus when you're simply stimulated? Which one are you going to try first, cold or coffee? Drop it below. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe. More brain hacks every week. 5 concrete protocols. How to test both effects on yourself safely. Cold showers and coffee both feel like they wake you up, but they don't spike the same brain chemistry the same way. Coffee reliably boosts alertness through caffeine blocking adenosine, and that chain tends to lift dopamine signaling indirectly. Cold exposure, meanwhile, hits norepinephrine hard, your stress response system gears up fast, and dopamine can move too, but the pattern is more tied to the hard reset feeling than the smooth, dose-dependent ramp caffeine gives. Sound familiar? That's the key. Don't chase a myth like dopamine is higher. Test what actually happens in your body and attention. Here's the plain mechanism. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, so your brain doesn't get the slow-down signal. Then arousal systems kick in, and you often feel more motivated and focused. Huberman's discussions emphasize that norepinephrine is a big player in alertness and that cold exposure tends to drive that system strongly. Cortisol is the other piece. Cold can nudge stress physiology upward, while coffee can also raise it a bit in some people, especially if you're sleep-deprived or already stressed. But cortisol isn't the villain. It's your body's effort signal. So your goal is to compare how intense, how long, and how clean the wake-up feels for you. Now, the safe, concrete protocol: you're going to run 2 mini experiments on yourself, same day, similar conditions, and with simple measurable outcomes. Use one variable at a time. Pick a baseline window first. Get one neutral measurement session where you're not using either, just regular morning routine. Then pick a time when you're not right after a terrible night of sleep. Keep hydration consistent and don't stack other stimulants. Safety check. If you have cardiovascular issues, uncontrolled hypertension, a history of fainting, or you're pregnant, don't do hard cold exposure without medical guidance. For cold, don't go ice bath hero on day 1. Start with a cool to cold shower you can tolerate while staying calm. Aim for control, not suffering. Hold the first trial to a short, repeatable exposure, something you can do without shaking uncontrollably or feeling chest discomfort. For coffee, test a consistent serving amount and drink it on a mostly empty stomach for 1 session and after food for another if you want 2 conditions later. The deal is this: don't change dose and timing at the same time. Timing matters because caffeine effects build and cold effects peak differently. What you're tracking isn't some invisible dopamine meter. It's performance and felt state. Reaction speed in a quick app test, focus quality for a timed deep work block, perceived stress, and sleepiness rebound an hour later. Here's a simple scoring system you can run for 2 weeks without getting nerdy. Pick one standardized focus task you already do, reading with notes, coding, writing, whatever, and do it for the same short duration each day. Right after each intervention, rate, alert, calm, motivated, and jittery on a simple scale you define. Then repeat the same ratings before the task and again after. Also note any anxiety spike, throat tightness, or shaky feeling with cold. If those show up, you scaled wrong. For coffee, track whether you feel wired without focus or focused without agitation. That tells you more than chasing neurotransmitter labels. If you want a cortisol proxy without lab equipment, watch your stress rebound. Do you feel calmer afterward or more keyed up later? The practical takeaway: cold tends to feel more like activation, coffee more like drive, and the winner is the one that improves your output with the least stress hangover. Quick safety rules before you test again tomorrow. For cold exposure, avoid if you get chest pain, shortness of breath, or dizziness. Don't do it alone the first time. Keep the first sessions mild and short, then slowly dial intensity only if recovery is good. For coffee, don't test it late in the day. Matthew Walker bangs on this point. Sleep quality is fragile, and caffeine near bedtime can mess with it even if you don't feel too awake. And if you're already anxious, you may want to start with cold at low intensity rather than stacking it with caffeine. So when should you use which, based on what Huberman talks about with norepinephrine and arousal? Use cold when you want fast activation and you can tolerate a bit of stress physiology, like a start-moving reset before action. Use coffee when you need sustained focus and you want a cleaner, steadier ramp, especially if you can protect sleep. But here's the part nobody talks about. The dopamine win you're looking for might not matter as much as the behavioral win: better attention, fewer mistakes, and no rebound crash. Which one are you going to try first, cold or coffee? Then tell me how your focus and stress felt for the next 2 hours. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe. More brain hacks every week. 6. Interpreting results. Measuring, controlling bias, and making decisions. The messy part isn't the answer, it's how you measure it. Dopamine isn't something you can just feel and then confidently map to one drink. Real talk. Most dopamine studies don't even measure dopamine in your bloodstream in a simple before and after way. And that matters for cold shower versus coffee, because both can make you feel more alert without necessarily producing a clean, direct dopamine peak you can point to. Let's talk mechanism in plain English. Cold exposure tends to crank up your stress response circuitry. Norepinephrine goes up fast, your sympathetic nervous system gets fired up, and that can change how dopamine-related pathways behave downstream. Coffee, on the other hand, blocks adenosine through caffeine, which removes the brake on wakefulness. That wakefulness boost is tied to multiple systems, including dopamine signaling in reward/motivation circuits, but it's not a guarantee of a bigger dopamine spike than cold exposure in the way people assume. Andrew Huberman often frames caffeine as adenosine antagonism leading to increased alertness, while cold is more acute stressor that activates arousal. Same outcome on the outside, you're awake. Different wiring underneath. Now the part nobody talks about: bias control. If you test this on yourself, you're not running a lab. You bring expectations. You bring mood. You bring sleep debt. You bring the fact that cold feels hard and coffee feels rewarding. Those factors can shift perceived energy, stress, and motivation, and dopamine is tangled up in all of that. Daniel Kahneman would call it the mess you get when your brain makes judgments under uncertainty. So if you only track first felt good, you'll fool yourself. You need a measurement plan that separates alertness from stress from pleasure. Here's a practical way to interpret results without pretending you've got a neurotransmitter lab in your kitchen. Use objective-ish markers you can repeat: reaction time, heart rate trends, and how long the wired feeling lasts. Cold exposure often comes with a surge-like alertness and then a recovery curve. Coffee tends to ramp up and can linger longer depending on dose and tolerance. If you're monitoring physiology, remember that norepinephrine and cortisol are more direct stress arousal signals than dopamine is in most real-world contexts. Huberman's discussions around cold usually emphasize the sympathetic/norepinephrine side first, while caffeine is usually presented as an adenosine-driven alertness switch. So if your goal is dopamine-Y motivation, you might interpret higher pleasure, novelty-seeking, and drive after coffee differently than the first can handle things arousal you get from cold. For decision-making, pick your intent first, then match the tool. If you're doing something that needs sustained focus and you want a cleaner pathway to wakefulness, coffee often makes more sense. especially if you pair it with work you actually want to start. Cal Newport talks a lot about turning attention into a skill, not just chasing stimulation. Caffeine can help you initiate. If you need a fast reset from grogginess or you want to train your nervous system to tolerate discomfort, a cold shower can be the better move, but it's more of a wake-up through stress adaptation, not a dopamine dessert. That's also why some folks feel calmer and sharper after cold, while others feel edgy. Your baseline matters. Safety matters too, because interpreting results includes not getting hurt. Cold exposure can spike stress responses, and if you have cardiovascular issues or uncontrolled blood pressure, you should be cautious. The general safety approach from medical guidance is simple. Don't do extreme shock temperatures, avoid going too long, and don't take risks if you've got fainting history or heart problems. If you're prone to panic or have breathing difficulties in cold water, treat that as a red flag. Start with something manageable and build tolerance slowly, the same way Anders Ericsson's deliberate practice idea applies to skill building. You don't start by maxing out the hardest set. But here's the wild part. Measuring dopamine directly is rare, so the smarter question isn't which spikes dopamine more, it's which intervention shifts your arousal and motivation in the direction you need, with tolerable stress. If coffee makes you productive but too jittery, you might be overdriving norepinephrine-like effects without getting the focus you want. If cold makes you alert but short-fused, you might be trading dopamine-like drive for stress arousal you can't metabolize. Which one are you going to try first? Cold shower for a tough reset, or coffee for a focus kick? Drop it below. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe. More brain hacks every week. So here's the bottom line. If your goal is a quick hit of alertness and first am awake now, both cold showers and coffee can get you moving fast, but they push different buttons. Coffee tends to dial up dopamine-linked motivation and reward vibes through caffeine and adenosine blockade. You feel that kick because your brain interprets the signal as wake up, go time. And that pairs with norepinephrine activity too, which is why you get that sharper focus. Cold exposure is more like a stress-to-adapt signal. It can raise norepinephrine and shift your system into alert mode, but it's not the same reward pathway as caffeine. For a lot of people, it feels like clarity. For others, it feels like a jolt, and then, if you overdo it, a bit of misery. Cortisol can show up more with cold, because your body treats the shock like a training stimulus. Sound familiar? You do it too hard, then you wonder why you feel off later. Now, what's the practical takeaway you can use today? If you need sustained productivity, start your day with coffee, then ride it with movement and focus. If you want to reset, mood lift, and that switch-flipped alertness without stacking more stimulation, cold can be your tool. Use it when you're not already maxed out. And here's the part nobody talks about: safety and dose. Cold doesn't mean you go numb. Keep it gradual. Don't jump into ice bath hero mode. If you've got heart issues, uncontrolled blood pressure, or you're feeling chest pain, don't skip cold exposure. Talk to your clinician first. If you're healthy, think short, manageable cold exposure, not punishment. Your nervous system should adapt, not crash and burn. So which one are you going to try first? Cold, coffee, or a smart combo? Drop it below. If your brain liked this, hit subscribe. More brain hacks every week. Next time, we'll break down timing too. When to hit caffeine, when to use cold, and how to avoid that wired but tired trap.